Today, we're going to kind of do a really broad survey of Marxist economics, specifically on capital. The reading covered, parts from all three volumes of Capital. So there's going to be a breadth of content that I'm going to kind of try to force my way through quickly here. So the first point I want to come to is economics is a field of study. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is an economy? And the definition that I often use to explain to people is an economy is simply an engine of production and consumption. And the analogy that I draw to people's everyday life is your fuel economy is your car's ability to take potential chemical energy and turn it into actual mechanical energy or work. Every economy is basically some kind of, iteration of that mechanic. And since we're able to take this mechanical view of an economy, we can analyze economies via the scientific method. You can propose a hypothesis as to how an economy will act. You can measure the inputs, outputs, and other data that comes from the economy. And then you determine the validity of your hypothesis, analyze, come to conclusions, revise, and then repeat, accordingly. And this allows for highly accurate modelings of economies. Things that the economy are not. The economy is not a religion. Economics should not be the observation of what we consider to be natural phenomena or human nature. And I bring this up to address the issue of the rational actor myth that was, perpetuated by the Chicago schools, specifically Milton Friedman in the 20th century, or the idea that the economy is some kind of natural organization of production and consumption based off human nature. And you saw this with feudalism, where the lords were considered to be like the divine, right? Like it was a heavenly order, so to speak. It was a way to justify production through myth, and we should not do that. Also, the economy should therefore not be controlled by hierophants, meaning officials who use things like monetary policy, fiscal policy, etc., as a means to manipulate the market, promote growth, or cause recession, obfuscate the purpose of an economy, and keep it oriented to serve the bourgeoisie while alienating the proletariat. This alienation in the proletariat is due to a lack of agency. You can look at our own current economic situation right now, in which we face massive inflation, massive interest rates, and possibly a recession, definitely, falling opportunities, all of which are outside of the proletariat's control. We have no way to address that as a class right now. So now I'm going to move on to the base and the superstructure. These are pretty simple concepts. The base is basically the economic structure of society. So the mode of production, be it feudalism, capitalism, etc., the productive forces being labor, the means of production, and then the natural resources or products from other stages of capitalism that need to be refined in the current stage. It also includes the relation of production and the structure of class within the mode of production. So it includes the relationship between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And that brings us to the superstructure, which Marx says rests upon the base. And that is the culture, politics, and other societal aspects that are used to help reproduce the base. We find this in our law, our politics, our religion, and our media, all of which are oriented to maintain and reproduce capitalism. And the relationship between the base and the superstructure is the base creates the superstructure, which again reinforces the base. And it's important to recognize that this dynamic should not be taken as economic determinism. Engels was very specific about that. So we're going to move on to understanding value. The first value we'll look at is exchange value. So to understand exchange value, we first have to understand what a commodity is. A commodity is simply a product created to be exchanged on a market. So a product exchanged on a market has intrinsically an exchange value, what you've exchanged it for, right? The book uses the example of a shirt might be worth, the reading uses an example that says a shirt might be worth 100 cans of baked beans. And so it reflects what the commodities have in common rather than their specific qualities in order to find a system for exchange. Moving on, we have use value, which is the ability of a product, which doesn't necessarily have to be a commodity, right? You don't have to get it from the marketplace to accommodate some kind of human need. And that need being met must be specific. Like a book has no use in solving one's immediate hunger, right? You can't eat a book, basically. There is a relationship between use value and exchange value, obviously. Use value does not necessarily assure exchange value, and exchange value does not necessarily assure use value. For example, air has a high use value, like without it you die, but it's has a low exchange value. It's hard to bottle up and sell, although I did see some of that on Amazon today, which is crazy. Alternatively, NFTs have a very low use value, but had a high exchange value due to the speculative market that they're a part of. It's funny, ET. The other way that we can measure value is through labor, and this is Marx's labor theory of value, which he is not the sole arbiter of, right? It was previously thought of by Ricardo and Smith as well, but he makes some distinctions. So the commonality of all commodities is the labor time necessary to produce the commodity, right? Like that's what we can basically reduce every commodity down to, is how much time it took to make. The exchange value is a reflection of the labor power necessary to produce the commodity. Though like any reflection, it can be distorted due to qualities of the commodity itself or the marketplace, such as supply and demand, right? If there's excessive demand for limited supply, that's going to distort the value of the commodity, or the price, I want to say, not the value. And we'll get more into that later. A use value or useful article, therefore, has value only because of the abstract human labor objectified or materialized in it. So a commodity has use because the person accessing the commodity is spared the abstract value of the labor by not having to produce the commodity themselves, while still, being able to access the use value. An example, this is like Marx is famous for talking about, bolts of linen and coats. If you buy a coat, you are saved the necessary labor needed to turn the bolt of linen into the coat. But in turn, you probably had to sell your labor to get the money, or sell a commodity in order to get the money to afford the coat if you did not produce it yourself. And Marx says on the dual character of labor, on the one hand, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense. And it is in this quality of being equal or abstract human labor that it forms the value of commodities. On the other hand, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in a particular form and with a definite aim. And it is in this quality of being definite useful labor that it produces use values. So since all commodities are produced via labor, labor forms the basis value for all commodities, and also measures the total product of society's labor. But labor must be diversified and particular to assure that all the needs of a society are met. So labor must take a specific form, and that the labor can be exchanged, but also a general form. And that brings us to the concept of socially necessary labor time. That's the average labor time necessary to produce a commodity with a specific focus. So working slower would not increase value because labor time is averaged, right? So, and then the other thing is that working on non-specific tasks, which a lot of people would refer to as mud pies, is labor without production, and thus does not qualify as socially necessary labor time. So we move on to the concept of distribution. In capitalism, labor is a commodity, and it thus is distributed through the market. This means that there's no mechanism through which a society can collectively determine how labor should be distributed. It's purely subject to market forces. So due to this, there must be this concept of generalized commodity production, meaning that due to the specialized nature of individualist capitalist producers, they must exchange products with one another to meet their needs. This is because capitalism is the first system of production, not focused on production, it's focused on production for exchange, not to meet the needs of society. It can only be determined if a commodity meets a social need after production is complete and has been put on sale for the market. If that commodity is not purchased, then it cannot be said that the labor used to produce it was socially necessary. So now that we've kind of evaluated value, we can look at the concept of money. Money arises as a commodity for the exchange of other commodities. It's a universal equivalent. So whenever you give rise to a marketplace, you generally give a rise to some kind of money. It's not something that can really abstractly be removed from a marketplace. This allows all commodities to have their values evaluated against one another, and these values should reflect the socially necessary labor time to produce the commodity. So now we move on to the concepts of surplus value and exploitation. The first thing we need to address here is the commodity exchange. This is how most people, specifically the proletariat, interact with the capitalist economy. The proletariat sell their labor as a commodity for a wage, which gives them access to money to buy more commodities necessary to sustain themselves. Capitalists, on the other hand, do the commodity money exchange, which is where they have money, they buy commodities, and then they exchange them for more money by selling them on the market. So the commodities that the capitalists purchase can include the labor of the proletariat. So the extra money that is taken through this commodity money exchange is the surplus value. And this surplus value is in effect stolen wages. It's the difference between the money that the capitalists paid for the commodity of labor and then sold the production of that labor for. Again, labor's value is determined by the socially necessary labor time to keep the worker alive, for the system to perpetuate, i.e. like the worker raising a family to maintain the proletariat class, and the labor produced after that threshold is met is considered the surplus value. It is surplus labor particular to the capitalist mode of production. In Marxist economics, we refer to this as the exploitation of labor. Exploitation naturally arises out of the capitalist system by paying labor its exchange value and not the full value of what it produces. This depends on separating the working class from the means of production, right? The relationship of the proletariat to the means of production means that they must sell their labor as a commodity. They don't have the means to realize their labor without the means of production, which they don't have access to without the bourgeoisie. And so this brings us to the concept of the rate of surplus value. That's the rate of exploitation. It's the ratio between the surplus valuable and variable capital being what the capitalist has invested in labor itself. So surplus value for the capitalist can be increased in the absolute sense by increasing the working day, thus increasing the total hours the worker is exploited, or it can be increased in its relative sense by increasing productivity, which lowers the power of labor and reduces the amount of socially necessary labor time needed to produce a commodity, thus lowering the necessary labor time and creating a surplus value. And to quote Marx on this, he says, like every other instrument for increasing the productivity of labor, machinery is intended to cheapen commodities and, by shortening the part of the working day in which the worker works for himself, to lengthen the other part, the part he gives to the capitalist for nothing, the machine is a means for producing surplus value. So that moves us to the concept of capital. Capital is the accumulation of value to create more value. This is commonly mistaken as wealth or the means of production, but Marx refers to it as the self-expansion of value. Capitalism encourages the development of the means of production to increase relative surplus value, ostensibly the first stage of history where the exploiting class has an incentive to expand productive forces. This occurs through the investment in constant capital, which is capital invested in the means of production that does not expand in value the way that variable capital, so capital invested in labor, does, right? Because you can't exploit a machine, really, so to speak. This is because the value of constant capital is transferred to the commodity as it deteriorates through use in production. Marx refers to the means of production as dead labor, as it only represents the labor that was put into constructing the means of production. The means of production does not add value after that point. With the production of relative surplus value, the entire form of production is altered, and specifically capitalist form of production comes into being. That's another Marx quote. Labor is organized around a system of machines and industrialized, and this also socializes the labor process as production is organized into large units to be mechanized, and often involves highly complex divisions of labor. So the aspects that come into every capital, such comes down to the fact that capital is the self-expansion of value, which arises from the exploitation of the worker in production. Thus, what distinguishes capital from other modes of production in which social production develops is the surplus value and the specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of the direct producers. So this brings us to the concepts of competition, prices, and profits. So we first need to consider capital volume 1 as an abstraction. It's designed to grasp the essential features of a capitalist economy and distinguish it from other forms of wealth and other modes of social production and developments. It does not examine the effects of competition or the effects of supply and demand on commodities or commodities exchange value or price. So competition. As capitalism has no collective way for social labor to be distributed among different activities, producers can only relate to each other through the exchange of commodities. Therefore, it is an essential feature of capitalism that no single producer controls the economy. This forces individual capitals to act as individual capitals, seeking development of productive forces to increase relative surplus value. And the intent is to devalue one's commodity to increase the total market share the producer occupies. This causes the market value of a commodity to reflect the prevailing conditions of production within the industry it is produced. This brings us to price. Price and value are not intrinsically the same thing. Value, as previously discussed, is the socially necessary labor time necessary to create the commodity. Well, price is the amount of money, the universal equivalent commodity, that the commodity will fetch at a marketplace at a given time. Price can be influenced by supply and demand, as well as other market forces. And Marx argues that ultimately these fluctuations cancel each other out over time. Rate of profit is distinct from surplus value, which measures the degree of exploitation of labor power. Rate of profit is the ratio between surplus value and the total capital invested in a venture. So both the variable capital, which is the labor, and the constant capital, which is the means of production. And the rate of profit relates to surplus value to total capital, as I just mentioned. The ultimate goal of capitalism is to generate more capital. Therefore, rate of profit is ultimately the primary concern of capitalists. Rate of profit is dependent upon what is called the organic composition of capital, which is the ratio between constant capital, so the means of the investment in the means of production, to the variable capital, the labor. It determines the amount of machinery and raw materials per unit of labor necessary to make the commodity, and capitalists want to maximize the variable capital component of this ratio in order to maximize their profits. The higher the productivity of labor, the higher the organic composition of capital. Now, capital also has this interesting phenomenon called the equalization rate of profit. Because capital will flow from one industry to another, seeking the highest rates of profit, ultimately a general rate of profit is formed, which reflects the total surplus value for society against the total social capital invested. This leads to individual capitals receiving a share of the total surplus value extracted in proportion to the total capital they've invested rather than the variable capital that they've advanced. So, we'll get more into it as we go on. The general rate of profit is the total surplus value compared to the total social capital. And as capitalists shift capital to different industries seeking the greatest rates of profit, they will cause overproduction, which will cause the market prices to drop as the goods exceed demand, causing the industry thus to become less profitable. Inversely, as capital has been removed from the less profitable industries, it will underproduce, driving down the supply and causing the price to increase, making it more profitable and causing the cycle of capital seeking profit to continue. This will continue until profit and spheres of production become the same, and thus the values are converted into the prices of production, which we'll get into in a little bit. The general rate of profit requires the values of a commodity and the cost of prices to be different. And Marx points out that the deviation of prices of production from value always resolves itself into one commodity receiving too little of the surplus value, while another receives too much. So the deviations from the values which are embodied in the prices of production compensate for one another. And this can be seen as the competition of capital in different spheres, creating a price of production, which equalizes the rates of profit across different spheres. To quote the reading, it says, it is if all these surplus value pumped out of workers, wherever they may be employed, flows into a single pool from which capitalists draw the profits in proportion to the sums they've invested. The general rate of profit requires a transformation of value into cost prices that are different from the values. And Marx refers to these converted forms as the prices of production, which was briefly mentioned earlier. He says, what competition first makes in a single sphere of production, what competition first in a single sphere of production achieves is a single market value and market price derived from the various individual values of commodities. And it is competition of capitals in different spheres which first brings out the price of production, equalizing the rates of profits in the different spheres of production. So Marx points out that the deviation of price of production from values always resolves itself in one commodity receiving too much or too little of the surplus value while the other receives too much. He defines this price of production as the cost price plus the average profit of production. Sorry, I've lost my place. Okay. Okay, a production price can be thought of as a type of supply price for products. It refers to the price levels at which newly produced goods and services would have to be sold by the producers in order to reach a normal average profit rate on the capital invested to produce the products, not the same as the profit on the actual turnover. And this brings us to trying to understand some criticisms of the labor theory of value. So Marx ignored.
Lazy.
So Marx ignored the value of commodities represented by variable capital and constant capital that must also be converted into prices of production. Marx was aware of the problem, but he did not consider it important. And later research indicates it actually has pretty far-reaching impacts. However, the mathematical solutions to this problem have not invalidated Marx's basic account of the conversion of values into prices of production. There are techniques to determine prices for commodities that do not involve starting at their values, but that's not what Marx was focused on. He wasn't trying to provide formula for determining ratios of values of commodities. He was trying to reveal the historical development contained within the capitalist mode of production and the economic law of motion of modern society. And the labor theory of value proves instrumental to this end. So this brings us to accumulation and crisis. In non-capitalist modes of production, there's a minimal accumulation. The bulk of surplus product seized from the producers will be consumed. Therefore, the object of production is consumption. This changed under capitalism, where the surplus value is not designed to be consumed, but rather reinvested in production to yield more surplus value. This is not a reflection of greed like Milton Friedman might have suggested, but rather insofar as capital is personified, his motivating force is not the acquisition and enjoyment use values, but the acquisition and augmentation of exchange values. As such, he shares with the miser an absolute drive towards self-enrichment. But what appears in the miser as mania, the mania of the individual, is in the capitalist the effective social mechanisms in which he is merely a cog. So this goes back to that concept of it not being a personal failure, not a reflection of the nature of man, but rather we enact our role of society. We enact our role in the base. And this is effectively caused by the competition of many capitals. Capital that does not reinvest itself will find itself outstripped by its competitor. This brings us to the forms of reproduction. Simple reproduction is production that is not renewed or that is renewed at the same level as previously. So like the economy is stagnant. We've seen this in most economies previous to capitalism. And then extended reproduction, the surplus value is used to increase production. And that is now the norm that we see in our current capitalist system, which ultimately causes crises, right? So crises arise due to the unplanned nature of capitalist production. The rate of profit has a general tendency to fall under capitalism. Marx theorizes this is because because of the constant increase in the productivity of labor. He was quoted as saying, or in capital, the higher the productivity of labor, the more machinery and raw materials an individual worker is responsible for. In other words, the amount of constant capital invested in plant, equipment, and raw materials grows relative to the variable capital used to pay the workers' wages. In value terms, this means that organic composition of capital is higher. We've already seen because labor power is the source of surplus value, the higher the organic composition of capital, the lower the rate of profit. So as productivity increases, the rate of profit falls. However, the increase in constant capital in the organic ratio means less workers are needed, which in turn expels workers from the industry and creates a reserve army of unemployed workers, which can be used to keep wages low. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall is bound with the tendency for the rate of surplus value to rise. This is a Marx quote, sorry. Nothing is more absurd for this reason than to explain the fall in the rate of profit by the rate of rise in wages. Although this may be the case by way of exception, the rate of profit does not fall because labor becomes less productive, but because it becomes more productive. Both the rise in the rate of surplus value and the fall in the rate of profit are specific forms through which growing productivity of labor is expressed under capitalism. And that's from volume 3. The tendency for the rate of profit to fall is what causes many crises. These crises are crises of overproduction in capitalism. Too many commodities have been produced to realize adequate profits for the capitalists. This is contrary to every other economic system in history, which would have crises of underproduction, where there were not enough goods to meet demands. Crises solve themselves through the destruction of a large amount of capital, bringing constant capital. Crises solve themselves through the destruction of a large amount of capital. Constant capital is brought in line with the cost necessary for reproduction, thus correcting the organic composition of capital and increasing the profit rate. So crises serves to restore capital to a condition in which it can be profitably employed, and also, by consequence of this, leads to a concentration of capital as smaller businesses are forced to consolidate during these crises or be bought by larger businesses. And that is my presentation. Thank you, everybody.